slide. And I'm going to talk about evidence packs as something I've not actually talked about before. So let's see how this goes. And I'm hoping to talk for 35 minutes or something like that. And then if you have any questions, there'll be an opportunity to ask them. And I'm going to start by a little bit of history, if you will, a little bit of background. And so what I've noted while thinking about this talk, that over the last year or so, I've tended to talk mostly about diversity in trials, or the poor methods we use in trials. And this is about dissemination, really, about how we can improve the way we disseminate and share the information that comes from our research, that is packed within our systematic reviews. And it's actually an idea that's been kicking around for quite a long time. So in my head and people I work with. So one of the things which I think is important about ideas that stick around, so like some ideas I might have had ages ago and I've forgotten them, this one never went away. The dissemination problem, the problem we have with systematic reviews, and the fact that some of that evidence does not find its way into use. What are the problems with that? That has stuck in my mind for quite a long time. And I think some of the reasons for that is that you can find evidence that supports the problem being a problem. Like, it's not just my imagination or the imagination of others. And also the problem crops up in a number of different places. And you're like, okay, I can see the connections between that. And it's actually fundamentally the same thing. In other words, the problem is exactly that, it's a problem. So what I want to do first is just do a little bit of background that led us to these information packs. And it has a fairly long gestation, that history. And the first bit I'm going to talk about, oddly perhaps, is trial recruitment. So the systematic review that I've been involved with most is a Cochrane methods review on recruitment strategies to improve recruitment to trials. And I've been looking after that for at least, let's say, a dozen years, something like that. And this graph is a graph I use in talks and training, and basically it's studies over the years that have looked at the proportion of trials that actually hit their recruitment target. And what if the world was perfect, all of these bars would be green. That's essentially what you need to look at, is how much green is there. And the first one is 1984 and the bottom one is 2017. And what we see is that actually it's not all green. There's also some that partially hit the target and some that are well off the mark. So over the years, recruitment is not getting dramatically better. It sort of hovers. If we were really, really kind, we'd say it was hovering at, I don't know, high 40s, 50% of trials hit their target when people looked to see what proportion of trials hit their target. And we might think, okay, well, the systematic review that I've been looking after since at least 2010, what sort of impact is that having? None at all, I guess, is what we might conclude from this. Things are not getting better. We're gathering some evidence. We're looking to see what sorts of things might improve recruitment. What impact is it having? None whatsoever when you look at this sort of graph. And that is, that's worrying. And so, we spend time doing our reviews. We would want to see some improvement. We might expect to see some improvement in the thing we are studying. Also, this is probably about 8 years ago, a colleague of mine, was a PhD student, Heidi Gardner. And as part of her PhD, we were asking people about their knowledge of relevant systematic reviews, in this case, recruitment. So we were asking people who recruit to trials or people who design recruitment strategies. And when I say we, what I really mean is Heidi asked these individuals, what do you know about this systematic review that has been done and designed to try and help you make decisions? These comments are entirely typical. So the first one, a recruiter, somebody who's tasked with recruiting individuals. Well, I've been meaning to read it. And the designer, this person is an individual who's tasked with designing recruitment strategies. Let's basically say, well, I'm aware of the Cochrane reviews. I really do try and take it on board. And that individual, when pushed a little bit further was actually thinking about the Cochrane retention review. It wasn't the recruitment review. So I had a vague idea of a strategy, of a review, but it was for a different strategy. So essentially, the take-home message from that, if you imagine the work involved in doing a systematic review, our target group, the take-home message from them was, we have no idea what's in your Cochrane review, to a first approximation. It's not really informing our decisions at all. We sort of know it's out there, some of us, but anyway, I've not looked at it. So that was dispiriting, but again, feeding into this question that there's work we're doing not having the impact that we might think it would have in its current form. And then in sort of like year 2000 or so, started involvement with a project called Decide. No, this is 2010. And this was about guidelines. And it was a project, I remember at the time, that clinical guidelines was not really something that I'd had much involvement with. But it was a fabulous team. And I thought, okay, it's an EU funded project, big project, run for 5 years. Let's get involved with that. And it turns out this has been one of the most influential projects I've ever been involved with in terms of influencing my thoughts about how we package and disseminate research evidence. And we did a piece of work, this was led by Kirsty Loudon, asking members of the public about their knowledge of guidance. There were lots of strands of work within it, so we also asked health professionals and policymakers as well. But the bit we were most interested in this piece was patients. And we were asking the public and patients essentially how aware they were of clinical guidance and the fact that their treatment may be greatly influenced by things called clinical guidelines. And awareness ranged this is from 0 through to a really quite high degree of awareness. But generally speaking, it was much closer to 0 than it was to 79% if you look at the sort of systematic review evidence. So in other words, most people are public, patients are completely unaware of the existence of clinical guidelines. And if you think about in the UK, NICE, and in Scotland, we have something equivalent. Countries in the West, at least, tend to have organizations responsible for developing guidance. The public, and these are international studies we're looking at, they have no idea about all of that. So that this idea that evidence is informing their care and that evidence is packaged into guidelines, no idea. To a first approximation, most people, not all of them, but most. So that also fitted into this narrative of there's something we're really not doing very well with regard to the dissemination of our work, that body of evidence that we're gathering in our reviews. So we sort of concluded that, okay, so for a review to be useful, people clearly have to be able to find it, and they have to be able to understand it, and it has to provide some information that they can actually use in their decisions. So that was a sort of bit of a summary. So, you know, if people are not able to find your review, clearly it's going to have no influence whatsoever on anything they do. If it's written in a language that is impenetrable, not going to influence anything. And if anyway, the information it provides is not actually what they're looking for, it's not going to influence any of their decisions. And from Decide, we had a number of what I would think of as key take-home messages. And one was that we're thinking of a systematic review. The people who are interested in the body of that work are either specialists, so it might be methodologists like me, people who are really, really interested in the area, or just very enthusiastic others who, for one or other reason, have become very interested in the nitty-gritty. But most people have no interest in it, the body of that review. They're neither the time or the motivation to plow through all of that work. So if we package all that material, put it out, most people have no interest in most of it. Would be one of the key messages we picked up from Decide. We need to think carefully about how to package that evidence. And if we think of my Cochrane recruitment review, now somewhat out of date, I think it's 2018, it's 185 pages long. So it's a big document. It is not written in the style of a novel. It is not a page turner. It's not how we write these things. And also, interestingly, it has almost no evidence that people can use, because there is very little good evidence. And this, I guess, is a challenge that many people doing systematic reviews will find, is you look at your evidence and find that an awful lot of the included studies are rubbish. And somebody then who's faced with evidence that is not looking very relevant, is as dull as dishwater to actually read it, and it's very long. Not going to encourage people to actually engage with that review. Most people, some people will, specialists, and some people might be very, very enthusiastic about a topic area, but the way they are put together is not ideal for widespread dissemination and use. So again, all of that over a number of years and from different directions has basically led me to think, well, okay, the review itself, so when we published that Cochrane systematic review, that review is not, cannot be the key dissemination product, because it's too off-putting. There's too much of it. There's too much wading through stuff to get to the key message. And some of those key messages that came through with Decide are around, tell us what to do. What is the thing? Does it work? Should we be using it? And that we'll see in a moment. It will influence the direction of these evidence packs. I mentioned Heidi Gardner a while ago, linked to her PhD. And she was asking people, once they told us that none of them had ever heard of my systematic review, then what she was asking, well, what do you want then? So what information would be useful to you if you were designing a recruitment strategy for a trial right now? And we had some evidence about different strategies. What would actually be useful? And essentially, this is the sort of feedback we got. What people really want to know is, does it work? Should we use it? And that essentially is exactly the same as what health professionals say about clinical guidance. Does it work? Should we use it? And the does it work bit should be clear. I write it in, and they actually did literally say, write it in big letters. So we know how much of an effect we might get from this thing. And some sort of electronic dissemination tool or website is what we're looking for. So what we did historically was this. This is essentially, okay, what it is a telephone reminder. So people who've been sent a postal invitation, if you then phone up on the people who do not respond, that the evidence suggests that will increase recruitment by 6%. So this is what comes from the Cochrane review. What people really want is the thing. This is telephone reminders, a description of what it is, and the 6%. As you can see, it's in very big letters there. We've actually sneaked in something about certainty. People were not actually asking for certainty, but we put something in. But that's how it sat for quite a while. We moved on to other things, didn't have resources to come and do more with it. But then the important change, or two important changes really, COVID and Evidence Synthesis Island. And these two things combined together to give us a motivation and some means to start thinking a bit more carefully about work that would come from Heidi's PhD and also from the Decide work, and some sort of general sense that the review itself is not a particularly useful dissemination product for many of our users. And what we came to is trial forge evidence packs. And the reason COVID came into it is because we wanted to start packaging evidence on things particularly linked to retention at the time, because as in the UK, many trials were being stopped, paused for recruitment, and retention was clearly then very, very important for these trials. So we've paused recruitment, let's work on retention. So we thought about, could we start issuing summaries of the evidence that we have linked to retention, and a couple of other things like the movement from face-to-face activities through to remote activities. Could we package some of that evidence in a concise way? And the reason Evidence Synthesis Island is mentioned there, along with Hannah Bryn, my colleague in Aberdeen, is that Evidence Synthesis Island provided some resources, which is to say money, to enable us to push this idea further than we otherwise would have been able to do. So we did more of these. We could think about it a bit more carefully. And York, the TrialForge SWOT Centre in York, at York University, were really helpful too, with helping us to think through how we would package this evidence. So it was a sort of coming together of a few things that made this idea of TrialForge evidence packs doable. Okay, so I'm going to show you now what the packs look like and some of the key items on them, and then we'll be winding down. So this is the first bit of a TrialForge evidence pack, and it's probably the key bit. So it's a 2-pager, and the idea we wanted was something that is standard, in the sense that any intervention, for example, within the Cochrane recruitment review or the Cochrane retention review, or in principle, any other review, could be summarized in 2 pages. And it summarizes it in a number of ways. So I'll go through some of these bits separately, but there's a block on at the top, that box. That's essentially the what is it, does it work, how big is the effect? We wanted to say something about the practical impact. What is the impact of using it compared to not using it? And then we wanted to say something about what do we know about this particular intervention, this thing. And we decided to present that as a cumulative meta-analysis. And then we have something called a resource bundle, which is some other stuff, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Okay, so what the idea was that we could produce one of these for any intervention, and certainly on the methods side, but I think other it'd be interesting to apply it to a clinical intervention. We haven't, but you could think of it. So this would be standard, and you do it for anything. And it was fixed, so everyone would look the same. Obviously, the data within them would change, but the format would be exactly the same. You know exactly what you're going to get. So if we look at the summary, remember that Heidi found that what people are really interested in is, what is it? Does it work? And something about the size of the effect. So this is basically all that is. Tells people what it is, telephone people who do not respond to a mailed invitation. But does it work? We give that statement essentially in 2 ways. So the first one is in words, and this wording is a structured sentence, so that we don't choose those words because we think they run together nicely. We're actually using grade guidance 26 to form that sentence. So the choice of words is based on the grade overall certainty and the size of effect. And if you haven't seen grade guidance 26, I really would recommend you use it. I think it's a fabulous piece of work because it makes writing the narrative statements about effect really structured, and there's consistency in the words. So use the same words in the same way for any intervention if you follow grade guidance 26. Underneath that, we've said, I guess this, I've got here, how big is the effect? Essentially, it's saying, does it work in a different way, this time in numbers? And we give that 6% again with the confidence interval. And we haven't felt able to lose certainty. We think that's important. So we have given the grade certainty as well. So what is it? Does it work? How certain are we? Essentially, that's what we get in this package. And remember, again, from Decide, I was saying that people really are interested in, what should we do? So we've told us about this thing, we can see how big the effect is, what should we do? So we wanted to give a recommendation. So we give a recommendation, and that's where Hannah and Heidi Gardner and other colleagues in Aberdeen and at the University of York in the SWOT Centre came together, and we would come together and make decisions based on the evidence in front of us as to what we thought a recommendation could be. We did that reasonably well. I think that is an area where it can make substantial improvements. But we bring together the evidence, consider it as a group, and then make a recommendation. You can see here we said consider using them, but ideally as part of an evaluation. So we've said, yeah, think about using them, but you might want to evaluate them too. And then the next box, the one at the bottom about can I use it? Within the resource bundles, that would say things about how you might go ahead and use this particular intervention. And that I will mention in a moment. So recommend, I should have clicked this earlier. Recommendation, it says something about what we think you should do. And then the can I use this straight away the bundles that go with those are things that would enable you to use this intervention. So it might tell you how to structure the telephone reminder, for example, what you should say on the call, how you might decide who gets the call. In other interventions where it's about text messages, sending text message reminders, it would say something about the content of those text messages and perhaps how often to send them. So it's the idea with a resource bundle is practical help to enable a trial team to actually use that intervention. So it's not simply a sort of statement that says telephone reminders, it actually provides more than that. The practical impact, this was something also linked to Heidi's work, which was tell us what might happen if we use it compared to what will happen if we don't. And we tried within Heidi's work a number of ways of presenting this, and the people seem to work, people liked it, it seemed to work as well as anything else. So we present our practical impact information in terms of people. So the top one, we have an example. So imagine a trial. Imagine a trial needs to recruit 30 participants, and the initial recruitment is 30%. So that's completely arbitrary. So we're just making something up as our starting point. So imagine that trial, and what that happens to mean conveniently is that you would need to approach 100 people to recruit 30 of them. So the group at the left, the sort of dark gray, they're the people you recruit, but the longer groups of lighter gray people, they represent additional people that you would approach but would not be recruited. So together, dark gray and light gray, all of those people you would have to approach, but only those colored dark gray would actually be recruited. But now imagine the same trial, but using telephone reminders. And what this shows is, okay, if you use telephone reminders, it bumps up recruitment to 36%. And what that means is that there are now, you only need to approach 83 people to recruit the 30 that you need. So the coloring here is that sort of pinky red group at the end. They are people who you now do not need to approach to recruit, because you will have recruited the 30 you want sooner because of that improvement in recruitment. That's essentially what we're trying to show with the practical impact. That pinky red group, people you don't need to approach now, but you'll still hit your recruitment target. That's the sort of size of benefit, if you like, in this concrete example. That's what we're trying to get across with practical impact. So we do that for all of the ones we do, and we imagine a trial. And for the recruitment ones, we always try and stick to the you need to recruit 30 participants, and then we use the same example. And then we give this cumulative meta-analysis. This is not telephone reminders, this is finance. And the idea with showing this is it shows people how the evidence is developing and how and if it's starting to settle. Is it starting to become something we think is consistent? This is the size of the effect now. It's settled. All the evidence is converging. So this one for finance, financial incentives as recruitment, is for 6 pieces of evidence, 6 trials, 5 of them done by a single group. And you can sort of see there's a sort of waviness as you add the data from each one. There's a bit of inconsistency. One shoots out that one of the trials seems to be pushing it in a different direction, or at least more of an effect than the other trials. So it shows you that more or less you can see the effect is something like a few percent up to maybe 8 or 9% max, and settling at around 4%. But it's giving you a sense of what all of the evidence together is showing. You could look at that graph and you know you are not going to get a 30% improvement. That's essentially what it enables you to say. So something about what the body of evidence looks like too. And then we have this thing called a resource pack. And when we were having our discussions, this was linked to the COVID work initially, we were thinking, well, we would actually want to tell trialists something about how they could use this intervention and also how they could evaluate it, particularly, of course, if that's what our recommendation is. You can try it, but do evaluate it. So it's bundles of stuff to make it possible to use the thing, whatever that thing is, whatever the intervention is. And if it needs evaluation, bundles of stuff to help you do that evaluation. So you get a head start. So I'm going to stick to financial incentives for this one. So we have 2 folders in our bundles. So folder 1 is stuff about using it, how to use this intervention. So the sort of material we've provided for this one would be, well, if you want to add it to your trial, then you may have to mention it as part of your ethics submission. So here is some text that you could add to your ethics submission around this particular intervention, so you don't have to invent it yourself. Here's a starting point. You can tweak it as you feel the need to, or perhaps it might be good enough as it is, but it will give you a starting point. And then there's a discussion of using financial incentives, things like how much would you pay, how often would you pay it, those sorts of background bits of information that might help you make a choice as to how much, how often, and exactly when you would use your financial incentives, something practical, in other words. And then for evaluation, then we give some other bits of information. So this first one is trying to help people think more carefully about where additional evaluation is needed. So I'll mention that in a moment, but that gives pointers towards which type of trial would be most useful to evaluate this intervention in. And bearing in mind, of course, these are all embedded trial process interventions that I'm talking about, recruitment interventions. If we're thinking of clinical interventions, we might be writing something different there. But it's essentially trying to give pointers to where most value is to be gained from future evaluations. We've got a protocol. So if we're going to do an evaluation, here's a protocol that would enable you to do an evaluation. So if you have a systematic review that concludes more research is necessary, what we're saying here, and indeed what we do say in the Cochrane recruitment and retention reviews, is, and here are some protocols to do those evaluations. So I think that's helpful to support future evaluation. Again, more on ethics. And then we also give the data. So one thing we think would be quite nice would be if somebody did another evaluation, in this case it's financial incentives, and decided that they would then write that up, then they could update the meta-analysis. So we give the data that they could slot their data into. So in the discussion section, perhaps, of their publication, they can give the updated meta-analysis that includes our data, the ones that we published, plus their new data. So it makes their publication that a bit more useful because it's got the updated meta-analysis in it. So we provide the data in these bundles. Where evaluation is needed. Now, this is something we've done particularly for these methods reviews, where we're talking here about recruitment. We've started thinking about it for retention too. But we have got some guidance that enables us to make decisions with regard to when is more evaluation required. And although we're applying it to methods trials, things we call SWOT, studies within a trial, and interventions that use that design, I actually think that guidance might have some utility for other types of intervention, perhaps clinical, but it's an easier place to start with trial process interventions. But we have some areas where we think it's important to look to see whether we have sufficient confidence in, for example, the certainty of the evidence to conclude that actually we don't need further evaluations. What's the context? What's the types of participant that we have in our body of evidence? Is that sufficiently broad that we conclude that we don't need further evaluation, for example? Do we know the benefits and the disadvantages of the intervention for participants? And in this case, because of the nature of these trials, also the host trial, the trial into which we drop our intervention. So what this is doing, the document around where evaluation is needed, is trying to give trial teams pointers to where they could present to the world most value by doing an evaluation. So it's saying not any evaluation, but why don't you look to do an evaluation in a non-drug trial, for example? If you're outside the UK, that would be really great, because most of the evidence for this intervention comes from the UK. Really great if you got some non-UK evidence. What about different sorts of financial payment? Most of the evidence here comes from £100 payments. What if it was a different amount? That would be valuable, be adding something. So that's what we're trying to do with this, give pointers towards where the evidence base could be increased in the most useful way to enable future decisions to be more evidence-based themselves. And if we come to how many of these we've got, sort of coming towards the end of the slides now, that evidence synthesis island work and now allowed us to, with Hannah in particular and Heidi, to do 2 pages for all of the high and moderate certainty evidence in the Cochrane recruitment review. So we have quite a few of these 2 pages for those. So we have all the high, all the moderate. We also have some of the low, and that's not the reason we only have a few for the low. Is not really a policy of running out of money particularly, but it was more of a policy in the sense that the information value of some of these low certainty ones is really quite modest. So we didn't prioritize them. For the retention one, we're only really just getting started. So we have a few, but we don't have all of them, all of that. Well, there are no high certainty evidence ones in the retention review, but we haven't got all of the moderate ones either. So we've got quite a few examples of these, but we haven't got everything covered in those 2 reviews. And I'm not aware of this approach being applied to a clinical review, and that would be interesting. Something that's not asking a methods question, but is asking a clinical question. And could you summarize the evidence using a similar format? My gut sense is you could. Be interesting to try it. When it comes to resource packs, we have resource packs for some, but not all. So the 2-pager takes some work. The resource packs take a bit more, because we are really trying to gather things that will genuinely be useful, and that takes work. So that's something that the York team helped us with a lot during the height of COVID. Both they and we put quite a bit of effort into that, and then Hannah and myself did a sum of the additional ones we did with the evidence synthesis island money, but we mostly expanded the number of 2 pages we've got. Okay, so I'm going to end on this slide. So the summaries for this then are the review itself. I think the important thing, one of the important things to take away, is that the systematic review itself is not the main dissemination product, and that is something that has come up as a challenge in several different bits of my work over quite a few years. Similar message: this publication, it does not on its own cut the mustard. The thing that allows us to compress our work into something that fits onto 2 pages is the fact that that large review exists. Without it, I don't think we'd feel remotely confident in such a summary, but with it we do. And starting to think that are these summaries the more important dissemination products, and they're at the intervention level. That works fine for us, what we're doing with recruitment and retention. It may not work in the same way for more complicated issues, clinical issues, but the review itself could be broken down into interventions, and we can present evidence at the intervention level. So think about the audience, and that's Heidi's work greatly informed what we've done on recruitment and will inform what we've done on retention, and also the DeFi projects. They're very similar things, but also in that case for health professionals. Tell us what to do, does it work, what should we do, should we use it? And I think all of us need to work more at evidence implementation. You remember that recruitment graph I was showing you right at the start with the green or lack of? That, yeah, in trial methods at least, I think that's a big challenge for us, is getting that evidence that we have actually use an influencing decision. Remember, most people who were designing strategies, recruitment strategies, or implementing those strategies had no idea that the systematic review on retention and recruitment strategies actually existed. No idea at all. It wasn't influencing their decisions. And the last point is, if you're interested at all in helping with evidence packs, then do let me know, because they're quite nice pieces of work when they're done. We actually make them citable. So we've started experimenting with that, and I have actually seen one publication that cited one. So there is a sort of citation we have with them. So they're satisfying pieces of work, but there is work involved in doing them. And I think I'll stop there. So hopefully there's something in those packs that makes you think a little bit more, okay, we could present some of the evidence with the systematic reviews a little bit differently, and that perhaps that might be a really nice way of presenting at least some of the evidence in reviews that you're working with too. And I will now stop there. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing just in case